Funding for Brampton Memories of a Small Town has been brought to you in part by the Rotary Clubs of Brampton.
Hello, I'm Michael Seaman of the Brampton Heritage Board, and welcome to Brampton Memories of a Small Town. When we stop to consider what features of our environment represent our heritage, we often find that although individual buildings are an important part of this, the picture goes far beyond this to include groups of buildings, bridges, natural landscapes, etc. As with all other significant pieces of our heritage, our primary goal in conserving them is that these aggregates of historic features, better known as heritage districts, be maintained in a careful manner to ensure that ours and future generations can continue to experience this amenity. The Ontario Heritage Act under Part 5 provides a means for protecting these characteristics of these areas by allowing designation of entire heritage conservation districts. Among the types of areas which have been designated as conservation districts under the Ontario Heritage Act are commercial and residential streetscapes such as Old Oakville and downtown Perth, historic industrial complexes such as Goodrem and Wirtz in Toronto, natural areas and small hamlets and villages such as Mississauga's Meadowvale Conservation District. In 1990, the City of Brampton established its first conservation district to protect the significant features of the historic village of Churchville. We are now talking to Bob Crouch, a longtime resident of Churchville, Vice Chairman of the Brampton Heritage Board, and the Chairman of the Churchville Heritage Committee. Bob, being founded in 1815, Churchville has quite an interesting history, doesn't it?
Churchville was founded by Europeans in 1815, but of course the settlement of the Credit River predated that by some thousands of years. The pre-Algonquian Indians used the Credit River for transportation and fishing. And there is evidence that they've been around for up to 5,000 years. For a couple of thousand years before the European settlement, the Credit River was a popular fishing and gathering spot. The Mississauga tribe of the Algonquian Indians had a significant camp at the south end of Churchville, including 3 structures that were unearthed archaeologically during the introduction of a gas line a few years ago.
Who was the first European settler to come to Churchville?
It's generally thought that a fellow named Amaziah Church from Virginia founded Churchville in 1815, and perhaps we could visit his tombstone.
Bob, so this is the famous wooden stone of Amaziah Church?
Yes, this marker is Amaziah Church. He was the first fellow buried in the Churchville Cemetery. Amaziah Church was a United Empire loyalist from Virginia, who walked up with his family from 1812 through 1815 with gears for his mill over his back. He would have arrived somewhere around Port Credit and wandered up the Credit River through the Credit Indian Reserves where he couldn't settle until he found his first spot to open his sawmill. At that time, Churchville, which is now largely an agricultural and residential area, was a great white pine forest. And he saw a significant mill race to power his mill and saws, and of course this huge resource of great white pines.
Mm-hmm. Where should we go next on the Churchville tour?
Perhaps we could go to the mill site.
Okay. So we're standing on part of the original mill site now, aren't we?
Yes, 200 feet behind us was the original mill site of Amaziah Church. He would have picked this spot because rather than see the greenery behind us, it would have been a great white pine forest. We would have been standing now among white pines. And we're now standing in the backyard of residential lots, but to our left and away from the river was the mill pond. You will have seen a map shortly ago which indicates an island, and we're standing right in the middle of the island with Mill Pond Street to the north of us. When Amaziah came to this part of the land, he came far enough away from surveyed lands that he could actually squat. He was never registered as a landowner, despite the fact he had significant holdings. The government surveys were done in 1820, and a fellow named Jacob Brill made the first purchase in this general area on July 20th, 1821. Through the 1920s, a second sawmill was developed, a couple of grist mills were developed, and Churchville became one of the largest growing communities in Peel County. By 1850, it had rather reached its apex, was beginning to be logged out. Hotelry then was the biggest industry, and we'll be walking down Main Street of Old Churchville shortly.
So we're now standing on what was Churchville's main street.
We are indeed in the business area of Churchville. Behind us is what was Fogarty's General Store, later Golden's General Store, and the last surviving commercial development in Churchville, aside from pick-your-own-apple farms and strawberry farms and a stable. By 1831, Churchville had some significant industry. There were a couple of hundred permanent residents, and as well, and you'll see this panning on the Main Street shot shortly, there were 3 hotels. In fact, hoteling was one of the biggest industries in town. There were 2 sawmills, 2 grist mills. Amaziah Church was still the principal developer of Churchville, and to our right, to the south of the river, was a significant commercial strip of enterprises, including blacksmith shops and wheel-turning shops and things like that. The house behind us, the rear, was built in 1840 and was in fact a wheel-turning shop and a residence. About the turn of the century, the front half of the house was put on, and it was then Fogarty's General Store. In the 1860s, the commercial viability of Churchville fell significantly when the Grand Trunk Railway was awarded to the city of Brampton, which then became the county seat. The courthouse in Brampton was built in 1867, and industry rapidly followed it, so that by 1870, Churchville was a town in decline, a commercial town affecting 60 or 70 residents, primarily commuting to Brampton.
I understand that William Lyon Mackenzie once stayed in a hotel in Churchville.
That's right. One of the other heritage shots that will appear on the program is a picture of May's Hotel. It is rumored that while William Lyon Mackenzie was escaping the police out of Toronto, that he came up the Credit River Road, which would then have been a corduroy road primarily used for moving wheat and logs down to Port Credit, and stayed at May's Hotel.
Although it wasn't named after a church, there were a number of churches in Churchville, weren't there?
Yes, there were 3 significant churches in Churchville. One of them still exists, and perhaps we could visit that next.
Okay.
Funding for Brampton Memories of a Small Town has been brought to you in part by the Rotary Clubs of Brampton.
So this is the Churchville Church, then?
This is the one remaining church in Churchville. It was a Wesleyan Methodist church. We had understood until about 10 minutes ago that it was built in 1864, but I'm going to be pleased to introduce in a moment May Hughes, the current owner of the property, and we just witnessed the cornerstone saying 1856. You will have noticed from a heritage picture that was shot shortly ago that the church was on the left side of the road, or the west side of the road. In fact, when a radial railway we'll speak about later went through town, they moved the church to the west side, to the east side of the road. There were 3 churches in Brampton, an Episcopalian, a Wesleyan Methodist, and a Methodist church, and when they were brought together as a united church after the turn of the century, this church became the United Church and carried on that way until 1971, when it was finally closed and the church populace went to Huttonville or to Brampton. Next door to this church was a brick church, and a part of the same church community after the United Church was put together. It was destroyed. The roof fell in as a result of a storm in 1952. And we'll be looking at a plaque in commemoration of that church. I'd now like to introduce May Hughes, who purchased the church property along with her husband in 1972, shortly after the church was closed. And she can be much more illustrative with respect to the church than I might be. How did you come to be introduced to Churchville?
Well, we came to be introduced to Churchville. We'd spent most of our money buying a very modern 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom condominium. And I'd had a lovely old settle table that I'd bought at an auction way before that, and had been looking for 2 church pews. So I read in the paper, the Woodbridge Times, I believe, famous for its auctions, that they were going to disband Churchville United Church because there were approximately 6 people left in the congregation, and of course it was costing money because they had to bring in a traveling minister, etc., every Sunday, so they were going to sell everything. And of course we found out that there were 60 pews to be auctioned. So we came, and it was a lovely day. It was Labor Day weekend. And we just fell in love with the place, and then we found out from the people concerned, the elders of the church, that they were going to auction everything, including the church, the Sunday school, and the land. So after my husband and I went off into the woods and had a quiet fight, and saying, "You're not putting me in debt again," we decided that we would stay and bid for the church, and we've never regretted it since.
Now, on the other side of the Churchville Methodist Church monument, we see the Churchville War Memorial, or specifically Churchville's answer to the Empire's call. Bob, this list on the honor roll list on the War Memorial is pretty much a good list of all the families that were in Churchville, isn't it?
Yes, it is a good list, and many of the families still are area residents, if not in Churchville and Brampton. For example, we have the Frasers, who are local farmers, the Huttons, I suppose one relative of City Councillor John Hutton. Local residents, particularly from the Second World War, include the Rains, the Pengillies, others I probably should mention.
There's an interesting story with the Lusitania on the First World War Memorial, which I see there.
Yes, I'm not familiar with the McMurtry family. I don't know whether they'd be relatives of Roy McMurtry or past Lister General and Agent General in London or not. But indeed, Churchville lost 2 residents, one on the Lusitania and another member of the Royal Flying Corps on October 14th, 1918, less than a month before the war ended.
Mm-hmm. Although Churchville is known mainly as a small village today, it does have some industrial heritage, doesn't it?
Well, of course, Churchville was a very important industrial town back in the 1850s. By the turn of the century, it was largely an agricultural service community. And the most significant piece of industrial heritage that still lasts is the steel bridge, which we'll go and visit now.
Okay. So we're now on the banks of the Credit River, and I see behind us we've now got the old Churchville Bridge. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, we're about 500 feet south of the mill race where we were earlier in the program. And this steel bridge was built in 1907. The heritage shot you just saw of it was Mr. Fogarty, who owned the general store, taking the first trip across the bridge in his wagon. I'm not sure who his neighbor is that's standing beside him. Mm-hmm. In the trees behind the bridge was the industrial mall that I made mention of earlier. There was a series of steel sheds that included a blacksmith shop and tannery and assorted dirty industries. By 1907, these shops had closed down. Churchville was in significant decline, and that was pasture. It's now just it's a municipal woodlot now. It's not privately owned. The bridge is a one-lane bridge, and it still exists primarily because this area has not been overdeveloped. The one-lane bridge crossing the river where it meanders through Churchville was the center of the irregular development that permits the open spaces and vistas that are available to all the residents of Churchville and gives Churchville its unique character.
The residents of Churchville use the bridge sometimes to raise money for the Churchville Cemetery.
Indeed, once or twice a year we'll have some local residents trying to raise money for the restoration of the cemetery by charging tolls.
Mm-hmm. With the Credit River running through Churchville and all the natural surroundings, is there any concern for this area being environmentally sensitive?
Yes, the Credit River has, over different periods of time, to succumb to a number of different sorts of pollutions, primarily agricultural fertilizer and septic systems. The Conservation Authority, which was founded in 1954, has done a significant job in promoting the cleanup of the Credit River. In fact, there's a television program, a half-hour television program about the restoration of the river and the return of the fisheries to the Credit. As well, the Churchville is very susceptible to flooding. In 1950, 51, 52, and with Hurricane Hazel in 1954, the floods of the Credit River would actually go over the one-lane bridge to the rear, and I would guess that the space between the water level now and the bridge is about 12 feet. In 1954, after Hurricane Hazel went through, the Conservation Authority was formed and expropriated what is now Churchville Park, an area we won't see in today's program, and a series of cottages in the park were sold, removed and sold to local residents who moved them up to an area called Martin's Camp. This is during the tourist area in the pre-Second World War and post-Second World War, where permanent residents were created. Martin's Camp, or the Circle as villagers know it now, is a significant part of the Heritage Conservation District that we know as Churchville as well. Environmental sensitivity, of course, also leads me to speak about the wetlands across the river to the north or the west. It's significant wetlands, I would think 40 or 50 acres, and we have the pleasure of a great deal of bird activity, a number of rodents, and a deer population that likes to frequent the wetlands in the spring.
Being at the center of a rural area, agriculture has played a large part in the development of the village, hasn't it?
Certainly, even in the industrial heyday in the days of the American Civil War, when a lot of flour was required to send down the Credit River and across Lake Ontario, Chincoosea Township was one of the major wheat suppliers, and Chincoosea Township starts about a half a kilometer north of where we now stand. As mentioned earlier, there were a couple of grist mills in town, and Churchville is famous as well for market gardening. Perhaps we could go now and look at one of the old turn-of-the-century brick farmhouses.
Okay. So we're now at one of Churchville's historic farmhouses, aren't we?
Yes, Churchville is largely made up of vernacular dwellings that were either wood siding or lath and plaster. However, there are 4 or 5 brick farmhouses, much like the one to our rear, that persist in Churchville. As indicated before, Churchville was largely a farming community, and this architecture is not only significant for Churchville, but significant for much of southern Ontario.
Well, it's certainly a good example of a vernacular farmhouse with the Georgian-style spacing of the windows and the facade and the 6/6 double-hung windows and the returning eaves. And it also has some neoclassical influences with the column-like structure over the doorway. But I think perhaps for today's heritage in today's world, it's also a good example of a house which is adapted to modern living with, but has been able to keep its heritage character by putting an addition onto the house which is very much in keeping with the historic style of the building. Bob, what sort of agricultural produce was Churchville famous for?
During the 19th century, Churchville was primarily famous for its wheat and its grist mills. But at the turn of the 20th century, as the urban demands of Toronto increased, there was also an increasing amount of dairy farming. During the First World War, a Credit Valley radial railway was constructed, which took dairy product from Churchville down to the Toronto area. And perhaps we could visit the site of the old Churchville radial railway station next.
Now, although Churchville was bypassed by the Grand Trunk Railway early in its history, it did actually have a railway line running pretty much right through the centre of the village, which was the Toronto Suburban Radial Railway. Bob, can you tell us about this?
Station 50 of the Toronto Suburban Radial Railway was at the intersection of Hallstone Road and Creditview Road, still a major intersection in this rather small village. Immediately behind us is the raised track bed. I hope that's visible on the camera. The Toronto Suburban Radial Railway largely delivered from Guelph, Norval, Eldorado Park, and Churchville and Meadowvale dairy products down to the city markets. As well, and particularly during the summer, it brought city visitors out to the country. Eldorado Park, immediately to the north of Churchville and about a mile north of us, was the site of many big band concerts with the famous pre-Second World War big band leaders. Churchville was famous for its Saturday night square dance down at the park, and many of the existing residents of Churchville were cottagers here in the pre-war times that came up to buy land in Churchville after the war because it was much cheaper than the city lands. The radial railway was closed in 1931. As we approach the end of our program, perhaps we could go on one of the scenic country lanes in Churchville and discuss shortly the Conservation District concept.
So we're now at Hallstone Road, which is probably one of the last of the old country lanes in the city of Brampton, isn't it, Bob?
I believe Hallstone Road may be the last country lane which is actually encompassed by the trees over it. And I guess at this point in the show, when we're wrapping up, I'd like to briefly describe the Heritage Conservation District that Churchville has become. In May of 1990, City Council resolved that Churchville was a Heritage Conservation District. And with the passing of the bylaw to approve that district, a number of guidelines were incorporated which maintain these scenic roadways, which maintain public plantings, and which impose guidelines on the property owners in the village of Churchville to ensure that future redevelopment is sympathetic with the significant vistas and green space that all of us villagers enjoy. The guidelines of the Heritage Conservation District are administered by a Churchville Heritage Committee, which consists always of a majority of villagers, along with member City Council, currently Councillor Hutton, and independent people from the city of Brampton with an interest in its significant heritage.
Bob, Churchville became part of the city of Brampton in 1974, but it still manages to maintain its own identity, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm proud to be able to say that the village of Churchville is still a significant neighborhood with a lot of residents enjoying the unique space that they have here. We hope to be able to protect the village of Churchville through the designation process from the inevitable onslaught of subdivision.
This brings to an end our look back on the history and architecture of Old Brampton. We hope you've enjoyed watching this program, and perhaps it has brought back a few fond memories for those of you who can remember Brampton when it was a small town. We also hope that this program has stimulated a greater awareness of the richness and diversity of architectural heritage in Brampton. Our inheritance of historic architecture is an irreplaceable asset and resource which plays an essential part in understanding our past and our sense of identity as a community. Unfortunately, it is often the case that we only become aware of the significance of a heritage structure when it is threatened or demolished. By understanding our local history and recognizing what are our most important heritage resources beforehand, however, we can take the first step to ensure that the significant landmarks from our past are there for future generations to see.
Funding for Brampton Memories of a Small Town has been brought to you in part by the Rotary Clubs of Brampton.
To comment on the preceding program, please call the response line 24 hours a day at 456-0860. Your comments are appreciated.